Hey everybody, Scott Aaron here, and so super excited for today's interview. I have the incredible Kara Goldin, who, a lot of people don't know this, and if you did know that I was part of the health and wellness industry, I had heard of Kara and her company years ago when I was running my last and final gym in Philadelphia. And just to kind of give you a little bit of background on Kara before we dive in, she's the founder of Hint Inc. They're best known for its award winning Hint water, the leading unsweetened flavored water. She's received numerous accolades, including being named EY Entrepreneur of the Year 2017, Northern California, and one of InStyle's 2019 Badass 50. Previously, she was VP of Shopping Partnerships at America Online. She hosts a podcast, The Kara Goldin Show, and her first book, Undaunted, Overcoming Doubts and Doubters, was released in October of 2020 and is now a Wall Street Journal and Amazon bestseller. So, Kara, with all of that behind us, welcome to today's episode.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, there's a lot to dive into, and there's a lot to talk about. And, you're an inspiration to so many people, obviously, with National Women's Month. Yesterday was National Women's Day, but
hmm
it's really a celebratory thing for all entrepreneurs, especially female entrepreneurs. And you've kind of blazed the trail for many over the last decade and a half. So before we kind of dive into everything that you're doing now, let's go back before Hint Inc. actually started. And what was Kara's life like before then? But the bigger question is, what was that entrepreneurial spark for you that played that catalytic role for you to go out on your own and build your own empire?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, sometimes you don't really know you're you're learning something until and being inspired until later on, right? You're sort of going back and Steve Jobs used to say connecting the dots, and then it all kind of makes sense. But I started my career after college in publishing. I thought I wanted to work in the magazine industry. I wanted to work in business magazines. I was a minor in finance and had really felt like whoever worked at Fortune magazine was godlike. Like
Mm.
they taught me how to really understand finance, which in my initial finance courses, I really found them difficult until I started reading Fortune magazine, and it kind of simplified things for me so that I could actually get through my finance classes and ultimately minor in finance. But it's interesting because when I got there to interview, which is a story I talk about in my book, I just showed up in the HR department. Is not where everybody goes when they're looking for a job. And I ended up getting a job not at Fortune, but at Time Magazine. And it's funny because I really wanted to work in editorial. I was a communications major and loved to write, but they weren't hiring people that were right out of school that had no experience. And so instead, I ended up working in this group called Circulation. I'll tell you a little secret. I didn't even know what circulation was until I actually got there and got the first job. I was an executive assistant. I worked for a woman, a great woman that is still a friend today, Brooke McMurray. And Brooke, I'm working for her in circulation. And, circulation, for those of you who don't know, is subscriptions. And it's fascinating because it's those in the magazine industry, it was those blow-in subscription cards that you fall out of the magazines that are really annoying that everybody throws in the garbage. But there's a method to the madness, and I still believe that the publishing industry is really kind of the early lessons were learned there, which would eventually become direct to consumer, what we see as direct to consumer today. So I was there for a couple of years, learning tons, ended up getting promoted out of my executive assistant role at some point, and was recruited to go to what is now termed as a late stage startup. I got a phone call from CNN, and they had heard that part of what I was managing was this thing called the airline circulation. And so Ted Turner had this idea to put monitors in airports for the news, and it was, it was a super interesting time. It was during the Gulf War, and and again, like CNN was not everywhere. It was, I think, 12% of the world had it, and it was only in about 40% of the US. So it was definitely second fiddle to ABC News and NBC News. But again, without experience, I wasn't going to be able to get any of those roles. So I ended up taking a job there, which ended up turning into an entry-level sales role at CNN. And I knew nothing about sales. I knew nothing about measurement and Nielsen ratings. I just knew that in the early days, we really didn't have much. So it was really about kind of explaining to people, storytelling around why CNN was going to be important. And I think that was really my first, my first kind of professional, real experience of seeing an entrepreneur in action. And it wasn't like I reported directly to Ted, but when Ted walked into the office, and Ted Turner, of course, in the CNN New York, he was putting stakes in the ground, as every great entrepreneur would do, to say things like everybody in the world should have access to news and know what's going on, even if it doesn't affect them, and that the world was becoming much more knit together in ways, and things like that. Like, there were some days he was a visionary entrepreneur. There were some days that we all really were on board. There were other days where we thought, does he know what he's talking about? And which is a typical, visionary entrepreneur problem, right? But I was there for a few years. I had met, actually, my now husband, and we ended up getting engaged and moved to San Francisco. I didn't know anybody in San Francisco. I was trying to figure out if I wanted to continue with CNN or not. But I really felt like the regional world of news was, everything was really happening in New York, particularly back then. And so I thought, who would I really want to work for in San Francisco? Who is it that really inspires me? And what brand is out there that I think is super cool and is making strides? And it was a brand called Apple. And I had been watching Steve Jobs and thinking, I would read everything that Steve would be talking about. And my husband was a brand new lawyer. He had just graduated from law school, so he had access to this thing called LexisNexis. And I remember looking up all of this stuff about Apple and Steve Jobs. And when I figured out that Cupertino, where Apple was based, was pretty far from San Francisco when I was living, I thought, maybe instead I should look at this other company that was a Steve Jobs idea that was started inside of Apple, that was doing something which I thought was really cool. I didn't fully understand it, but it was a thing called CD-ROM shopping. And so this was a little known Steve Jobs idea that was incubated inside of Apple. They decided not to continue it. And basically what they were doing is they were taking catalogers, mostly catalogers, sometimes retailers, and putting them on this disk. And Steve had this brilliant idea. I still think it's a brilliant idea today, where we were dealing with speeds of the internet because we were faced in the world with dial-up. And so at best, maybe we had 96. It was called baud modem back then. And so you would have to access the internet, you would have to use a telephone line. And for those of you who might remember this, like if you were on a chat room, for example, or message board and you needed to be online and your brother or sister or your spouse was on, you'd get cut off, right? Those were the days. So I thought it was fascinating what Steve was talking about, that basically you have this you have this disc and you put all these graphics on the disc and you just tell the consumer to load the disc in the machine, and the graphics would load onto the consumer's hard drive. And probably 95% of the people that loaded the disc into their machine didn't really understand how it worked. They didn't need to know how it worked, it just did. And so I ended up hearing about this little company. It was based in San Mateo, which was closer than Cupertino. And so I cold called the guy that was quoted in this article. He was the head of marketing. And I said, I would love to come and take you to coffee. I'm brand new to San Francisco. I don't know anybody here. I'd worked for this really cool company, CNN. And he said, you worked for CNN? What's Ted Turner like? And here all I'm trying to do is figure out, how do I get to Steve Jobs, right? That's where I want to. So we ended up having coffee. And then pretty quickly he said, why don't you come work with us? We're just trying to figure out the business model. It sounds like you have great experience in working on an entrepreneurial venture, disruptive things. And so I suddenly was the head of business development, and I'm going out to retailers, had no idea what I was doing. One of the stories I share in my book is going cold calling Mickey Drexler, who was at the Gap. And I said, hey, I'd love to get the Gap on this disc. And pretty funny story. But so this was the early days of direct to consumer. And again, had no idea sort of what we were doing, where it would be going, if it would be going anywhere. And about a year into the company, one of our investors, America Online, decided to acquire us. And they said, you go and run shopping. So suddenly I'm inside of America Online. And I am still working on the disc a bit as we're watching speeds of the computer heat up. And then basically I was asked to be the VP of shopping and e-commerce partnerships. So kind of the exact same job that I was doing at 2 Market, just on a bigger scale. And so nobody thought that e-commerce, this is 1996, was actually going to be happening. Many stories, including meeting with this guy in Seattle to try and get a bookstore online. Jeff Bezos, setting up bookshelves with Jeff in order to try and have a bookstore online. It was crazy times. And basically, after 7 years, it was $1 billion in revenue to AOL. This is coming from something that we didn't even have revenue targets in the early days. Had no idea what was happening, but it's a story that I share with other entrepreneurs about flying the plane while you're building it, right? You don't exactly know where you're going. Just every single day, you're making progress and making sure you're going somewhere. So finally, up to the point where I decided to leave America Online. It was a big company now. I had seen incredible entrepreneurs, including my newest entrepreneur that I was working for, Steve Case. And I thought, this has been an incredible, really exciting experience. It started small and then got big. And I still didn't know that I was going to start Hint. What I did know was that I had small kids at home, and I started really focusing in on what I was putting in their bodies. And at one point, I thought, I am not really practicing what I'm preaching. That what I'm putting into my own body versus my kid's body is quite different. And I realized that when I looked down at my Diet Coke can and saw these different ingredients. And I thought, I would never give my kids this. Why am I drinking it? And that's when I thought, I'm going to stop drinking it for a couple of weeks and just see if it makes any difference in my life. And I had sort of had this brain fog. I had gained a bunch of weight, had developed bad adult acne. And 2.5 weeks after giving it up, I got rid of the acne. I lost over 20 pounds, and the brain fog was gone. My stomach issues were a lot better. And I thought, this is diet. I thought that I was actually doing better by having diet. I'm certainly not going to go to full-fledged sugar soda. But for me, water, which was how I was staying hydrated at this point, was just super boring. And so, even you mentioned your previous life in the health space, I would go to the gym and I would still be drinking my Diet Coke. I mean, I just was so bored by water. And I thought, if I could get myself to drink water just by putting some fruit in there, then that would be great. And I started slicing up fruit and throwing it in the water, still never thinking that now it's my turn. I'm going to go take on big soda. None of that. For me, it was a discovery in my own house that I had stumbled upon, that I thought, if I could take this product that got me healthy to lots of other people, then I would be helping a lot of people, and that would be awesome. And it was very much about me, and very much about how I could help people, that drove me and inspired me to start Hint. It wasn't about starting my own entrepreneurial venture now, or even, starting a beverage company. For me, starting a beverage company was really the tool in order to help people gain health.
So, well, first of all, thank you for sharing that beautiful story. I love the journey of how people transcend, and I mean, you know the adage, everyone sees the glory but they don't know the story behind it, and I think you described that beautifully. And you mentioned a lot of inspirational and important people in your journey. Jeff Bezos, Steve Jobs, Ted Turner. If you had to look at the three of them and what they did, what they created, the vision that they had, what would you say is the biggest commonality that the three of them shared that was inevitably poured into you, that inspired you to do everything that you're doing right now with Hint?
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to be able to kind of hear how these people thought, right? I would just, at every moment that I could be in a room, or sit down and kind of read everything that they did. And, even to some extent, I never met Steve Jobs, but I would also just always be reading what he was saying, or trying to, sit in a room where he was speaking at some point. But I think that the biggest thing is that they had the idea that they believed consumers could understand, but there were some underlying things that were goals. So they were always raising the bar for themselves. And I'll give you an example. I remember, it's a crazy story actually, with Jeff Bezos. Barnes and Noble and Borders Books, no longer around, was those were kind of our top choices for booksellers on America Online. And neither of them wanted to work with us. And so I had heard about this guy in Seattle that was starting this book company. Truly, I felt like maybe we could get him to come in and be the bookseller, and then Borders and Barnes and Noble would see what we're doing with them, and then, they would come knocking on our door. So I reached out to Jeff and said, hey, I hear you've got this bookstore. Is there any way we can come meet with you? He said, you can come to Seattle. I'll only meet with you after 5:00. And I thought, all right, fine. I really need this guy. Great. So I go to his warehouse. It's a crazy story. There were no addresses on the warehouse. And so I'm driving around in this whole neighborhood. There's no addresses. And so finally I call him, and he said, yeah, I'm here. Can you imagine Jeff Bezos outside of the warehouse waving his arms, right? Like, here I am. And I'm like, okay. And it's 5:15. And he said, "You're late." And I said, I know, I was actually looking for the numbers on the warehouse. And he said, "Well, I have a bunch of bookshelves to build right now, so there's no way that I can actually meet with you." And here I'd flown from San Francisco to Seattle just for this meeting. And I said, "Well, let me help you build bookshelves." And he said, "You know how to build bookshelves?" Truth be told, I had never built a Home Depot bookshelf before, but I said, "Yeah, I'm like the best bookshelf builder ever." And he said, "Okay, fine." So me and my colleague, we go inside, and we're building bookshelves, and I'm trying to size him up. I'm trying to figure out if he can really handle it, because here's this guy who's the founder and CEO of Amazon, and he's building bookshelves right at 5:30 at this point. And I said, "So Jeff, why do you think you can compete with Barnes and Noble and Borders?" And he said, "Do you ever, first of all, do you read?" And I said, "Yes, I do, Jeff. I read." And he said, "Do you ever ask for recommendations?" This is 1996. "Do you ever ask for recommendations when you go to Barnes and Noble?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "Are they good? Are they like ones that you would actually go and buy the book?" And I said, "Sometimes, but I mean, how can I expect the guy behind the counter to actually know what kind of books I'll like, or maybe he hasn't read that book, and how can I, expect him to have it all in his head?" And he looked at me and he said, "The future of books, the future of," it was called e-commerce back then, it wasn't called direct to consumer, but he said, "The future of all online shopping is recommendations." This is 1996. And that did not come true until, arguably, maybe, I don't know, maybe 16, 17, 2016, 2017. Took 20 years. But Jeff had it in his head, right? He knew that that's where he was headed. And so I remember walking away thinking, I don't know if this thing is going to scale or not. Like, he's just doing books. And but I said, it left me thinking about that this person is thinking they're so much further ahead. They're having, these dumb conversations with people like me that are thinking that the world is just about selling books. And it was so clear to me that Jeff did that, right? It's the story of Steve Jobs and the disc, right? He's doing what he needs to do. He's building the bookshelves, he's selling books, whatever. But there's this goal, and he keeps raising that bar with things that can't happen yet, but they will. And he's going to take steps along the way. He's not going to say, "Okay, I'm not going to launch Amazon. I'm not going to sell books until I have a recommendation service." And so I think for me, again, going back and connecting the dots with so many of these entrepreneurs, they're putting stakes in the ground. They're simplifying the message to their audience. They understand who their audience is, but they always have these goals that are going to allow them to scale. And so that was Steve Jobs for sure. That was Ted Turner for sure. That was Steve Case. That was definitely Jeff Bezos. And to a great extent, I think it's what we've done at Hint as well, that it was never really about the beverage and just the beverage. For us, it was really about, how do we solve a problem around health that we believe consumers think differently about? For me, the word diet was health. And I think most people back 17 years ago thought the exact same thing. Today, diet sweeteners there's different games that are played, but it's definitely, when people have missions, when people have purposes, and then they tie a product to that in order to figure out ways to help people, as we've done with Hint, I think that is, it's a big thing, right? Yet there's many people who say, oh yeah, Hint is a flavored water company, right? They're not really, when I tell them, do you know how many people have shared that they drink Hint and they're controlling their type 2 diabetes, or they're getting rid of their type 2 diabetes because they figured out what diet sweeteners are actually doing to their system? Things like that. When you become that tool for somebody, when you become that solve for somebody, then that's how your brand starts to become ubiquitous in their life. Same thing with Apple, same thing with Amazon, same thing with CNN, same thing, not so much today, but with America Online. So I think it's fun to go back and look at some of those stories.
Yeah, I always say to people that when you can find out the gap or the hole or the void in someone else's life,
Mm-hmm.
chances are there's other people just like that individual that have the same gap, hole, and void. And when you can fill it, as you said, with a solution to a greater problem, that's how impact is truly felt.
Mm-hmm.
And as you look back on your journey and you're connected to all of these problem solvers, yes,
Mm-hmm.
amazing visionaries, amazing creatives, amazing entrepreneurs, but at the root of it all, they were solving problems for people. There was there was gaps and holes and things that weren't allowing people to get from point A to point B, just like yourself, and you fill that, and it's going to impact a ton of people without even realizing it. And you know, the one thing that always comes to mind when I hear about the entrepreneurial journey is we're all influenced by someone or
Mm-hmm.
some part of someone else's journey, and we get that spark and the light bulb goes off and it's like, yeah, I want to do something for the greater good. After progressing forward and launching Hint, what do you feel was the greatest learning lesson for you being on the other side of it? Not working for someone and not being attached to the visionary, but you now becoming the visionary and you now being the one that is impacting and influencing others. What was the greatest lesson that you learned being on the other side of the coin?
I think people don't really see everything that goes on in the mind of an entrepreneur, right? And I think that that's the advantage when you support entrepreneurs and then um, become the boss, right? That you're hanging a shingle and you're doing it. I was talking to an entrepreneur yesterday about this, and he's just starting out, but there's payroll, there's insurance, there's all these things that really, there's building bookshelves, right? There's all these things that when you're launching your company, there's hiring the right people, right? You hire the wrong person, and then what does that do to the rest of the people? Like all of these things, and then you're like, I'm just doing beverages, right? Like that's all I'm doing, but you're not really doing all of those things, and people are relying on you in order to make the right decisions, hire the right people, have enough money in the bank in order to uh, pay your pay your employees every couple of weeks, and so I think there are things that it's stressful, right? And never I don't think I ever thought, even for a minute, working for Ted Turner, or even in the early days of the little startup to market that was the Apple spin out, any of those things, right? Because you're not responsible for it. It's not something that you talk about, right? Necessarily. Maybe you talk to your CFO about it, but it's just not something that comes up. So I have a huge appreciation because it can be lonely. And it's one of the reasons why I talked in my book about this, that I think it's not just about a conversation around mental health. It's about responsibility, and you want to do the right thing. And sometimes you're grumpy, right? Because you're trying to figure a lot of stuff out. I'm sure, you've run your own business. I mean, you know what I'm talking about, right? There's, um, you want to inspire while you're also trying to deal with messes, right? And those are things that I think so many people don't realize when they are starting a company that is all a part of being an entrepreneur. And I had a huge appreciation for that starting, and still do to this day.
So, Hint has grown tremendously since its inception when you launched it, and it's hard to look into that crystal ball. And I don't think there's any entrepreneur when they do start their own business and launch their own company. Everybody has visions and goals of really making a difference, not only for themselves and their families, but for other people. In the very early stages of launching Hint, what was the vision that you had for the company at that time, comparatively speaking to where it is right now, and how much it changed over those years in between the beginning to the present time?
It's interesting. It hasn't really changed, other than the fact that I remember when we were launching the first bottle on the shelves of Whole Foods in San Francisco. And we decided to put a telephone number and an email on the back of the bottle, which that's what we did in tech. And I just didn't even know that people didn't really do that in the beverage industry. And so I remember the first week of getting bottles on the shelf. I had just gotten out of the hospital, delivered my fourth child, and I remember being in bed from recovering from a planned C-section, and I I'm reading an email from a customer who's sharing with me that he purchased a bottle of Hint, and he's so happy that he found it, because normally he doesn't even walk down the beverage aisle because everything is so sweetened. And he has this disease that I had never heard of called type 2 diabetes. And the minute he said type 2 diabetes, I'm, looking it up on the internet, thinking, what's the difference between type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes? I'm always curious, right? I want to educate myself. And so I reached out to him and I said, hey, this is our first week launching. I'd love to get your feedback. Do you mind doing a quick phone call with me? And I get him on the phone, and he said, and I said, so what's the difference between type 2 diabetes and type 1 diabetes? There's not a lot of information about type 2 diabetes. And he explained it to me that he was a marathon runner. I mean, he was super healthy, and all of a sudden he found himself passing out, and he couldn't figure out what was going on. And then he realized that his blood sugar regulation was super, super off. And when he stopped having diet sweeteners, he was never a huge sugar consumer, but when he stopped having diet sweeteners, which he had been drinking and eating for years, that he was able to stop passing out. So he was able to regulate it. And so he had been to a bunch of different doctors at that time. I think type 2 diabetes was maybe less than 2% of the population had type 2 diabetes. Somebody told me, by the way, that type 2 diabetes just went over the mark of 100 million people in the US today. It's grown significantly through the pandemic as well. But I think he and I having this dialogue about how this drink was helping him, and he's thanking me for launching this drink. I didn't launch Hint in order to solve a problem around type 2 diabetes or help people lose weight, right? For me, it was about health is something that is defined by the individual and something that they're trying to solve. I think what's super fascinating is oftentimes, and I think this is the case for brands in every industry, you can solve problems for people like this guy who was trying to find a drink that didn't have sweeteners in it. But oftentimes you end up solving a problem for people that they didn't even know they had,
Mm.
right? And so that's the case with Hint, where these stories would just keep coming in over the years, and they were health related, but they were different stories. They weren't all about type 2 diabetes, whatever. Um, and so I felt like, I mean, I guess this isn't necessarily answering your question directly, but I felt like having that connection with the consumer was giving me the drive to keep going. In a time when I had no idea how to make this product, I hadn't even tackled distribution, right? I had no idea. I had sort of some idea that Coke and Pepsi and were like the big guys, right? But I didn't really think that I didn't know the power that they had on the shelf and how that would impact my ability to scale. And so I think for me, being a little bit blind to kind of knowing what those roadblocks were, but also having that consumer connection where I was hearing I was solving problems. What I knew at that point after talking to this gentleman is how do I find the other, 2% of the population that have this disease? Because he's like drinking my Kool-Aid, so to speak. He gets everything that I'm trying to do. Now, how do I find them? How do I go up to people and ask them, hey, do you have type 2 diabetes? Would this problem, I mean, and again, it was such a small percentage of the population, but how do I find those people? And so instead, I kind of backed it out to try and figure out, okay, um, who actually diagnoses people with type 2 diabetes, and find those doctors, and then figure out again, like, where are those communities? Are there diabetes fun runs? Are there, we would show up there and pass out samples and tell people to go to their local store and tell them to stock Hint. So all of these things, I think that the lure for me too was that there was such an unknown. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know how to fly the plane. I was, getting traction along the way. So that was great from the consumer, but it was it was definitely a time that I felt like I was solving this big puzzle and I didn't have the picture. I didn't have the box, right? So I had no idea what I was doing. And then I would run into other people who would share with me that the first time that they paid attention to what they were putting in their body was when they got pregnant, and they got serious about, how many sweeteners were they putting in their body. And so I thought, okay, go to OBGYNs and talk to OBGYNs about this. Are there people who have gestational diabetes? And all of these different things. Again, I remember my whiteboards, like that I was saying, here are my consumers. But then, and while I found it fascinating and challenging, then I would go back into Whole Foods and I would say, or other stores, and I'd say, okay, these are all the consumers, and they'd say, well, we don't even know that about our consumer. So why would we put your product on the shelf? So it was fighting this fight that I knew that we would solve problems. I knew we could help people get healthier, but I didn't exactly know how I was going to do it.
The big thing I'm really pulling from that is awareness.
Yeah.
Because when you, again, when I launched and my wife and I launched our company a number of years ago, we were targeting specific demographics of people to help. But then we started to notice that other industries really resonated with what we were doing and what we taught. And we started to pay attention to that. And we started to realize, okay, there's something here. Even though we have that specific ideal client or avatar, so to speak, that we work with, there's all these other people circulating around the nucleus of that person that are also seeing something in what we teach and what we do.
Mm-hmm.
And in that entrepreneurial mindset, you have to have the wherewithal and you have to have the awareness to say, you know what, this was my intention and this was the person and the type of individual I wanted to serve, but obviously this is striking a chord with other people, and I need to lean into that aspect because now there's a broader spectrum of people that I can work with. So I think that's just brilliant on your part, having that awareness to saying, okay, all these people are stepping forward with XYZ issue and it's helping them, it's filling the gap in the hole that they have. So let's really connect the dots and find that connecting piece. And I love the puzzle analogy. I tell this to people all the time that entrepreneurship, because being a father and you being a mother,
Hmm.
doing puzzles with our kids, I tell people, what's the first thing you do? You dump all the pieces out, you take the picture of the puzzle, you put it next to you, and you go back and forth. But entrepreneurship, there is nothing on the cover of that box. You have all these pieces to the puzzle that you have to figure out as you grow and move forward with this. So,
Totally.
as we start to kind of wind down with this, a couple final questions. The first being, where do you feel and where do you see Hint going in the next 3 to 5 years with all of the growth that you've seen in the last 2 years?
Well, as I mentioned before, I don't think the mission has changed. The mission is to really help people, continue to help people gain health. We are only in the US. So I think there are plenty of people in the world who need health and are recognizing that they're not as healthy as they want to be. Going back to diabetes, I mean, type 2 diabetes is easily 40 to 45% of the population has type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes today. And we have problems as a society regulating not just sugar, but also the diet sweeteners and sweet overall that are kind of hitting our system. So I think Hint is a tool that can really help people gain their health. And I think if nothing else good came of the pandemic, I think this awareness of the fact that people need to pay more attention
Mm.
and they need to be ready to deal with how their body is in shape, what exactly is going on before something big occurs. And Hint is a product that can continue to do that. And I think overall, I think it's also what we've shown people is just by providing a product that is pretty simple. There's many people who drink Hint, for example, that, you know, don't have problems with diabetes. They don't want to lose weight. They just want to drink better tasting water, right? And they like it and they want to stay hydrated, all of those things. They want to drink it at the gym. Um, so I think that the mission and the purpose is really important, and we just need to keep growing it because there's a lot of people that really need help figuring this out. And the last thing I'll say is, I recognized something early on around diet sweeteners 17 years ago that people didn't understand, right? This was my Jeff Bezos, um, analogy, story of, I had this idea. I saw this problem. I saw this hole and I saw this actually two industries, not just the soda industry, but also the diet industry, how so many people were fooled. And I think more and more people are onto it, but we're not done. And I think when many people who are getting diabetes, type 2 diabetes today, have claimed to be trying. They're not having full fledged sugar. They're having lots of diet sweeteners and they're on different diets and they've still got this health issue. Why don't we wake up as a society and figure out that a lot of these processed foods, a lot of these things that are healthy perception versus healthy reality are not really helping us. And I think that that is the story that we want people to really take away from a product. And if you can develop a product that helps people think, that not only helps people stay hydrated, but helps people think differently about something, uh, that is, I mean, that's your legacy, right? That is what you believe you were meant to be here doing. And I think that it's such an important thing for people to remember. And I wish there were more people who would take their crazy idea and figure out how to make it happen, because I know there's a lot of them out there. And especially if you've got one that actually helps people achieve something, achieve health, and really make impact. That's a pretty awesome thing. So
I'm here. Little
good.
so it's all about changing the narrative, right?
Totally.
And I fully believe you're doing that and then some. And just to appreciate you being so vulnerable and open and transparent with your journey. Now, quickly, I just wanted to talk about your book, Undaunted: Overcoming Doubts and Doubters. What inspired you to write the book? But what could a lot of the people that I'm connected to, they love reading, they love learning and digesting content. So, what will the reader take away from this book, and how can they apply it to their everyday life?
Yeah. So I think that I found that the way that people could actually understand my why and why I decided to start this, I remember early on when people were asking me, a lot of magazines and different interviews were asking me to share why I had left tech. And it's interesting, I think a lot of them thought, oh, tech is bad and so male dominated and whatever the story that they had in their head. And I'm like, no, I just stumbled upon this idea that I could impact more people and do something that I really wanted to do. And so I would share these stories, and by sharing the story, I felt like there were a lot of people writing to me saying, "Hey, I heard you tell the story, and I tried Hint." And so that's why I started telling the story more and more, because I thought there's a lot of people who have tried Hint. They'll go into the Google offices and, they'll pick up a bottle and et cetera. But if there's other ways that I could get people to understand, and I truly believe that, and not just with millennials, but I think it's even more so with Gen Z, that they buy from people that are are truly doing what they believe is right, right? And whether that's uh, Elon Musk at Tesla, or Jeff Bezos at Amazon, or Richard Branson and Virgin, or whatever that is. So I think that was really the idea. If I could actually take all of my stories that I share in keynotes and different conferences and put them together in a book. It's funny, when I decided, I'm an accidental author too, because I didn't actually say, okay, I'm going to go write a book. For me, it was helping people, right? Not just people understand Hint in order to get people to know what I was doing, but also I felt like there were so many crazy stories on my journey of challenges and failures. And people would ask, like, oh, okay, how did you get to launch? Why did you decide to launch a direct to consumer business? And there's a story behind that. It wasn't as simple as, well, I was at AOL and then I just decided to go and launch a direct to consumer. I mean, that's probably a story that maybe people assume, but that's not the story at all. And I thought, if I could just help people understand that it's not a straight line, and there's moments when things are hard and things are challenging. So this book applies not just to people who are launching a beverage company. It applies to any entrepreneur. I've had many people who have reached out to me who have kids that are thinking about becoming an entrepreneur or are entrepreneurs, and they're understanding more about uh, who they're dealing with and some of the things that they're up against. But also, I think more than anything, that if you can do something that actually makes a difference, that you can stand up for something. Um, even there's a story in there about my son who's now just turned 20, actually 2 days ago. And how I had these moments where I was like, should I be working? I mean, maybe I shouldn't be working. Maybe I should, stay home. And what I realized after a few years of, all kinds of angst was that he was actually seeing a lot more than maybe I realized, right? He was learning that women actually can found companies, can be CEOs, can switch industries, can work with their husband, right? Can build teams, can go raise money. And all of these things that, again, when I started out, didn't really understand, but, and it is definitely an authentic, tell all book, too. So hopefully you'll get a chance to pick it up, or it's on Audible as well, if you want to listen.
Awesome. Well, I'll definitely put in the description of the episode where people can go and buy it and find it. Before I get to my last question, Kara, if people want to connect with you, whether it be online or find out more about Hint, what's the best way for people to go about reaching out and connecting with you?
Yeah, I'm on all social platforms, even TikTok. So at Kara Goldin. And yeah, definitely reach out, DM me for sure. And hopefully you'll hear my story and know that you can do it too. And it'll spur ideas for you to go and build your own puzzle, tackle that puzzle, and figure out what inspires you to do every single day.
Amazing. So, final question before we end the episode. What does success truly mean to you?
I think I think success is having impact, whether it's impacting uh, your family, your consumer, and making a difference in some way. So it doesn't have to be with a physical product. It can be with a service. It can be um, you know helping people um, in a nonprofit, whatever that is. But I think that that's really success, because I think that if you're helping people, I think that also drives a lot of happiness, right? You might see some sad stuff, some challenging stuff along the way, but it makes you feel like you have purpose and that you're doing something that is meaningful. And it doesn't matter what your gender is, or socioeconomic background, or what your product is or your company's. When you're doing something that actually has impact, that's success.
Could not agree more. And I've done a few hundred of these interviews over the last few years, and not one person, when I've asked that question, has said it's about the money. It's about the impact. It's about the things that happen from what they're doing, and having that deeper rooted purpose is what really drives us to help as many people as we can in whatever way that we can. So, Kara, I wanted to thank you so much for being on here today, being transparent, vulnerable, sharing so much love and value with my audience, and truly grateful for your connection and spending the time with you that we did today.
Thank you.
So, everyone, again, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please enjoy the rest of your days, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye, everyone.